Combating climate change, it's ultimately an urban issue. It's urban societies that are affected by the impacts of climate change, and it's also cities that emit the most emissions. So without working closely with cities, climate crisis is just going to continue to get worse. I'm Cara Eckholm. I'm a fellow at Cornell Tech's Jacobs Urban Tech Hub, which is an applied research center focused on the intersection of cities and technology. And the way I started working with the city of New York was coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. The mayor and the governor put together a task force of folks outside of government to advise on the recovery of New York's economy. And so I was on that task force, and one of the resultant recommendations specifically focused on how to make sure New York remained the global hub of urban innovation. And of course, New York plays a very interesting role in the ecosystem of global cities in that, dating back to the Industrial Revolution, it has been a location that people come to invent and try new things, including Thomas Edison, for example, and the early iterations of the electric grid, which were piloted in downtown New York off of Pearl Street. And so the interesting question is, obviously, we are no longer in the Edison era of invention, but we are entering a new era of green industrial policy, not just in the United States, but across the world, due to the need to decarbonize cities which emit the majority of the world's emissions by virtue of their population density. What does an idealized urban innovation ecosystem look like? And in my mind, there's 5 different players. And I'm going to describe now what their interaction would look like if the ecosystem was working perfectly, which is you'd have universities that are conducting research on problems in society. You then have companies that are started based on that university research. You then have operators who are often nonprofits or other kind of civil society actors that help those companies get community feedback and get their pilots into the real world. In Europe, for example, there's a whole network of, I think they call them living labs, but it's basically nonprofits that play this function. And then you have private financiers that once a product is ready to go, step in and allow those companies to accelerate their growth. And then you have government, which is playing multiple different roles. On the one hand, they need to be very proactive in feeding the university ecosystem with, hey, here are the problems we want you to be researching, as well as playing that sort of final step of, okay, so we see something's working, what policies can we change in response to things that are successful to allow those industries to grow, and where can we use our purchasing power to accelerate the growth of that new sector? So I think that, when you're thinking about your local urban innovation ecosystem, if you think about those 5 different actors, it's really important to make sure that all 5 are present, that they're communicating with one another. Because what I just described is an idealized ecosystem, but the reality is that it's super messy. And so one of the things we did in the report is we actually spoke to 30 startups and had them draw out what is your journey of how you started versus where you are today. And we asked them to highlight touch points they had with those 5 different parts of the ecosystem. And what was super clear for 100% of stories is that they interacted with all 5 parts of that ecosystem, and they did it in a different order, and they were bouncing back and forth as they went. The question of how you spur your local urban innovation ecosystem is not just, oh, we need more startups, or oh, government should do X, Y, and Z. It's thinking about the entirety of these actors and making sure the right subset of players and institutions are in place in your city to facilitate the ecosystem growth. I think what cities really need to do is have a clear process in place for how they engage the urban technology community, because otherwise they'll find themselves in a situation where there's a lot of companies in this space, and they are often run by people who have really positive motivations and want to see their product deployed in the real world. At the same time, government's not really set up to handle hundreds of inbounds from different vendors around the world. And so what it's incumbent, I think, on government to do is say, here's a problem we're having, and here's a structured process by which we will evaluate different technology solutions. And that then creates the framework in which someone like a startup can operate. I think then on the startup side, what has been exciting for me to see in the past few years is the number of people who are interested in really tackling the hard problems. If you look at the last 20 years of tech growth, sort of the phrase software is eating the world, right, was the kind of dominant mantra of where we would see technological progress. And there's many great things that software can do, but ultimately combating climate change is not just a software problem, it's a hardware problem too. And honestly, it's primarily a hardware problem. And I think, for entrepreneurs out there, it has never been a better time to be a climate tech entrepreneur. There is appetite to invest in those type of companies, and there's governments also that are willing to buy your product if you can show that it performs. And so I think for entrepreneurs, definitely encouraging your city, to the extent that it doesn't have one already, to structure some type of process for working with vendors is important. But also, I think another aspect of this is it's important for people to be looking around at the problems in their cities and be trying to address those in ways that cross the historic hardware-software divide.